If you believe these stories must be remembered, subscribe to Echoes of Valor and help keep history alive.
By the spring of 1945, the Japanese Empire was standing on the edge of collapse. What had once been a vast naval power stretching across the Pacific was now reduced to scattered islands, exhausted armies, and shattered fleets. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Japan, had been bled dry by years of relentless war. The battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf had destroyed nearly all modern carriers and battleships. What remained was a shadow of a fleet, trapped near the home islands, with almost no fuel left to sail. Across the Pacific, the United States Navy advanced with a methodical, unstoppable rhythm. Island by island, airfield by airfield, the American war machine tightened its grip around Japan. The fall of Saipan, Guam, and the Philippines had opened the path for direct assault. And now, with the landings at Iwo Jima complete and Okinawa under attack, the road to the Japanese mainland lay wide open.
Inside Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff understood the truth they had tried to avoid for months. An invasion of Kyushu was no longer a distant fear, it was practically guaranteed. Even more alarming, American strategic bombers now operated with freedom over Japan's skies. Entire cities, Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, had been reduced to ashes by massive firebombing raids. Civilian morale was collapsing, industry was nearly paralyzed, and the military's ability to resist was dwindling every day. In this atmosphere of despair, the Navy searched for something, anything that could delay the inevitable. The planners knew they no longer had the strength to win battles through conventional means. They also knew that Japan's air forces had been decimated, leaving the seas unprotected against American carrier groups. What remained was the idea that had guided many Japanese decisions in the final year of the war. If they could inflict enough casualties, perhaps, somehow, the United States might hesitate before launching the final invasion.
It was in this desperate mindset that Operation Tengo was conceived, a mission born not from strategy but from fatalism. At the center of this plan stood the most powerful battleship ever built, Yamato. A vessel so massive, so heavily armed, and so symbolically important that it had become a national icon. In theory, Yamato's 18.1-inch guns could tear apart any target afloat. In reality, the ship was nearly useless against the overwhelming air superiority now commanded by the Americans. Yamato had been built for a world that no longer existed.
Admirals debated her fate. Some argued to preserve her as a defensive platform for the homeland. Others insisted she should die gloriously in battle. But the final decision came from the highest levels of the Imperial Navy. Yamato would sail on a one-way mission. She would break through the American fleet at Okinawa, beach herself on the shore, and serve as a massive stationary fortress. Her guns would continue firing until she was destroyed. The planners knew that this mission would not save Okinawa. It would not save Japan. But they believed it would demonstrate to the United States that Japan was still willing to fight to the death.
When the order was delivered, the officers aboard Yamato understood immediately what it meant. The ship had enough fuel for only one direction, south, toward Okinawa. there would be no return, no rescue, no survival. This was not a mission designed to succeed. It was a mission designed to die.
When Operation 10 Go was formally approved, the officers aboard Yamato gathered in a cramped wardroom to receive the mission briefing. The atmosphere was heavy, and even the most seasoned men sensed the gravity of what was about to be announced. The senior staff officer read the orders without emotion. Yamato, along with a small escort force, was to proceed at maximum speed toward Okinawa, break through the American naval screen, and beach herself in the shallows north of the landing zones. Once grounded, the battleship would act as an immovable artillery platform, firing until she was burned out, destroyed, or overrun. There was no mention of return, no mention of refueling, no mention of survival.
For many of the younger sailors, the reality sank in slowly. But the veteran officers, the engineers, and the gunnery specialists understood immediately. They had seen the few manifests. Yamato had been given only enough oil to reach Okinawa, nothing more. In the official documentation, this was briefly noted as economic necessity. But among the crew, the phrase that spread throughout the ship was harsher and more honest. This was a death mission. The news rippled through the compartments. Some men responded with silent acceptance, bowing their heads in calm resignation. Others reacted with anger, seeing the mission as a futile sacrifice forced upon them by leaders who refused to admit defeat. And yet, for a small number, there was pride, an opportunity to die aboard the greatest battleship Japan had ever built, fulfilling the warrior ideals they had been raised on.
Preparations began immediately. Mechanics worked through the night inspecting every boiler and turbine. The ship's engineers, aware of the symbolic weight carried by Yamato, pushed for perfection. If the world was to witness her final performance, she would sail at full power, no matter how old or worn her machinery had become. Ammunition crews moved thousands of shells into storage racks. Yamato's enormous 18.1-inch shells, each weighing more than a small car, were hoisted into place with steel cranes. The anti-aircraft guns were restocked with fresh belts and magazines, though the crew knew the truth. No amount of firepower could guarantee their safety against the waves of American aircraft waiting beyond the horizon.
In the mess holes, sailors wrote letters they knew would never be delivered. Some slipped keepsakes into their uniforms, family photos, small charms, coins, hoping that if their bodies were ever recovered, someone might recognize them. Others visited the ship's small Shinto shrine, offering prayers in silence. As departure neared, the officers made their rounds, walking the decks, speaking to men who had served with them through years of grinding war. These conversations were short, often consisting of a simple nod or a quiet word of encouragement. No one dared speak of fear, though it hung in the air like smoke.
On April 5th, final inspections were completed, and the command staff assembled once more. Admiral Seiichi Ito, commander of the task force, made his position clear. If the mission showed even a faint possibility of success, he would carry it out, But if it became obvious that they were marching toward meaningless slaughter, he would turn Yamato around. An almost unimaginable statement from a senior officer of the Imperial Navy. His courageous defiance revealed how deeply fractured Japan's leadership had become. But when the final confirmation arrived from Tokyo, an unambiguous directive to proceed, any doubts evaporated. The operation would begin at dawn.
As the night sky settled over the inland sea, Yamato's boilers roared to life. Smoke drifted from her funnels, and the ship vibrated with the familiar, powerful heartbeat that had defined her existence since 1941. In the silence that followed, one truth dominated every mind aboard. They were preparing the most powerful battleship in history for her final and irreversible journey. At dawn, on April 6, 1945, the harbor at Tokuyama lay under a pale gray sky. A thin mist clung to the water, obscuring the silhouettes of ships moored silently in the bay. Then, just after 3:30 a.m., the quiet broke. Lines were cast off, engines rumbled to life, and the greatest battleship ever built began to move. The Yamato, accompanied by a small escort force, eased away from the pier and turned slowly toward the open sea. Operation Tengo had begun. To the sailors aboard the giant battleship, the departure carried an eerie weight. Many understood, without being told, that they were not expected to return. They had been issued one-way rations. Their letters home were collected in advance. The deck crews whispered among themselves, stealing glances at the grey outline of their homeland fading behind them. Officers tried to project confidence, but they too knew the odds. Yamato was heading straight into a theater dominated entirely by American carrier air power. Still, the ship pushed forward. The morning winds swept across her vast deck, rattling the anti-aircraft guns and carrying the scent of fuel in salt water through the corridors. The crew conducted final drills. Damage control teams reviewed emergency procedures. Gun crews loaded belts of ammunition and practiced tracking invisible aircraft overhead. Every man on the ship understood that these preparations were not hypothetical. They were for the battle that awaited them within a day. Even before Yamato cleared the Bungo Strait, the mission was no longer a secret. U.S. forces were listening. American radio intelligence stations intercepted Japanese transmissions describing fleet movements. Patrol aircraft from the Fast Carrier Task Force had already been covering the approaches to Kyushu, searching for any sign of a breakout. Yamato's massive engines left a detectable trail of noise and vibration across the ocean, and her speed and heading matched the profile of a major operation.
At 8:23 a.m., a single American submarine, USS Hackleback, spotted the force and sent an immediate report. Though unable to attack due to distance, the submarine's message was decisive. Large Japanese force heading south. The hunt had begun. By noon, American scout planes were in the air. From carrier decks hundreds of miles away, they fanned out across the sea, scanning the endless blue expanse for the unmistakable shape of a super battleship. While the Japanese hoped to slip through quickly, the U.S. Navy had every advantage: superior reconnaissance, superior air power, and total control of the skies.
At 10:14 a.m. on April 7th, the moment came. A U.S. reconnaissance aircraft descending through patchy clouds spotted a long column of wakes cutting through the sea. In the center of that column was a ship so massive, so distinct, that there could be no doubt. The pilot radioed his message back to the carrier task force. "Enemy battleship, Yamato, confirmed." Those words sealed the fate of the entire Japanese force.
Aboard Yamato, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The crew braced for the inevitable. The ship's speed increased. Lookouts scanned the sky. Officers walked the decks with rigid posture, offering final words of encouragement. The engine rooms roared as the battleship surged forward, waves smashing against her immense bow. But any hope of remaining unseen was gone. The U.S. Navy was mobilizing hundreds of aircraft, bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters from multiple carriers. They were forming strike groups with one objective: to sink the largest battleship ever to sail. As the hours passed, the distant hum of engines began to echo across the horizon. The final voyage of the Yamato was no longer a mission. It was a countdown.
At 12:20 April 7th, 1945, the calm surface of the East China Sea shattered. High above the Yamato, faint glimmers appeared in the sunlit sky, first as small dots, then as unmistakable formations of American carrier aircraft. The crew had been waiting for this moment since departure. Now it had come. The beginning of the firestorm. Aboard the Yamato, battle stations sounded through every corridor. Thousands of men rushed to their positions, boots slamming against metal decks, hands trembling as they loaded ammunition into anti-aircraft guns. The great ship vibrated with tension, engines straining as officers shouted new headings. The sea around the task group churned with white wakes as destroyers accelerated to screen the flagship.
The first wave consisted of dive bombers, Curtiss SB-2C Helldivers, descending from 20,000 feet. Their formation tightened as they approached, sunlight flickering off their wings. The sirens of their dives cut through the air like the scream of tearing steel. For the men on Yamato's open decks, the sight was overwhelming. Dozens of aircraft plunging toward them, each releasing a bomb aimed at the largest battleship ever built. Explosions tore across the forward deck. Bombs punched through armor plates or detonated on impact, sending towers of flame into the sky. Crews were thrown off their feet as blast waves rippled through the ship. Shrapnel ricocheted off turret faces. Smoke and fire rolled across the bow.
But the attack was only beginning. The second wave, torpedo bombers from multiple carriers, approached low, skimming the waves. Avengers fanned out in a wide arc, attempting to hit Yamato from both sides simultaneously. It was the exact tactic that had destroyed so many Japanese ships earlier in the war. Now the Empire's strongest vessel faced the same fate. Yamato maneuvered desperately, the giant hull heeling as she turned at flank speed. Her rudder carved deep trenches into the sea. Towers of anti-aircraft tracers filled the sky, forming a glowing lattice of red and white streaks. Dozens of 25mm guns hammered continuously, barrels glowing from heat. Gunners fired until ammunition belts dry ran, then frantically reloaded. Still,
torpedoes found their mark. One struck the port side amidships with a thunderous flash, lifting the entire battleship sideways. Another detonated near the engine rooms, flooding compartments instantly. Water surged through open wounds in the hull. As damage teams struggled to contain the flooding, more torpedoes slammed into the ship, each impact throwing men to the deck. The third and fourth strike proved decisive. Massive internal bulkheads buckled, power fluctuated, the speed dropped. The giant began to list.
American bomber squadrons returned again and again, dropping ordnance with clinical precision. Flames rose from the aft deck. Black smoke engulfed the superstructure. Destroyers around Yamato were also struck, plumes of water erupting beside them. Inside the battleship, chaos reigned. The heat became unbearable. Air was thick with smoke, and the corridors echoed with shouting, groaning metal, and the distant roar of engines. Officers urged the crew to stay at their posts, even as compartments collapsed and fire spread unchecked.
At 2:02 p.m., a bomb penetrated near the forward magazines. Flames licked closer to turret number 1. Inside the ammunition chambers were hundreds of shells, each weighing more than a small car. The outcome was inevitable. A blinding flash, a sound like the sky ripping open. The bow of the Yamato disintegrated.
The explosion was so powerful, it was seen from over 100 miles away. The shockwave sheared off entire sections of the deck. A colossal mushroom of fire and debris rose into the air, a funeral pyre for the mightiest ship ever built. The Yamato began her final roll. Men jumped into burning seas. Others clung to floating wreckage as oil spread across the surface like a black shroud. By 2:23 p.m., the giant was gone. The largest battleship in history had been defeated not by another ship, but by the age of air power.
When the smoke finally cleared over the East China Sea, nothing remained of the Yamato but scattered debris, drifting oil, and the bodies of men who had served aboard the most powerful battleship ever built. The sea that had reflected her immense hull only hours earlier now held the wreckage of a vanished dream, an entire military doctrine extinguished in a single afternoon. Operation Ten-Go, conceived as the Imperial Navy's final offering of resistance, had ended in catastrophic defeat. The scale of the loss became apparent almost immediately. Of more than 3,000 sailors who had set out on the Yamato's last voyage, only a few hundred survived. The destroyers that attempted rescue operations found the water aflame with burning fuel, thick with wreckage, and alive with the cries of men clinging to bits of wood or floating gear. Many survivors were badly burned or wounded. Others, stunned by the suddenness of the ship's destruction, spoke in fragments, unable to comprehend how their invincible symbol had vanished beneath the waves in minutes.
News reached the Japanese high command in Tokyo with devastating impact. For decades, the Yamato had been more than a warship. It had been a national emblem, a floating monument to Japan's industrial ambition and imperial spirit. Her loss was more than military. It was psychological, symbolic. It signaled that Japan had exhausted its ability to resist the overwhelming power of American naval aviation. In practical terms, it marked the definitive end of the Imperial Navy's capacity to conduct major operations. But the broader meaning stretched beyond Japan. The sinking of the Yamato, designed to withstand anything afloat, by waves of aircraft confirmed the new reality. Air power, not armor or guns, would dominate the seas of the future.
In the United States, the outcome was studied closely by naval planners and analysts. The triumph of carrier aviation at Okinawa validated the strategic doctrine that the U.S. Navy had been refining since the interwar years. The engagement demonstrated that even the most heavily armored vessel could not survive concentrated, coordinated attacks from modern aircraft. It showed that mobility, range, and striking power mattered far more than steel plating or gun size. For the Japanese people, the sinking of the Yamato eventually took on a more emotional, reflective meaning. In the years after the war, as the nation rebuilt itself from ruins, the battleship became a symbol of tragic sacrifice, of bravery committed to an impossible mission, of technology and pride that could not overcome the realities of modern conflict. Survivors' testimonies, preserved over decades, reinforced this sense of sorrow and respect. Museums, memorials, and documentaries ensured that the story became part of national memory.
Yet the Yamato's legacy also served as a warning. Its final mission showed the consequences of decisions driven by desperation rather than strategy, by symbolism rather than practicality. Historians often point to Operation Tengo as an example of how nations at the brink of collapse resort to gestures rather than effective military action. A costly last act that changes nothing but the number of lives lost. On the sea floor, the broken remains of the Yamato still lie where she sank, nearly 1,000 feet down, slowly eroding in the cold darkness. Her turrets, once capable of firing shells that weighed more than an automobile, rest upside down on the sand. The shattered hull is split into sections, testimony to the violence of the explosions that tore her apart.
But in another sense, the Yamato never truly disappeared. She lives on in lessons taught at naval academies, in documentaries and books, in the memories of the few who survived and the many who perished. She stands as a reminder of both the heights of human engineering and the futility of clinging to outdated doctrines in the face of changing technology. Her final voyage marked the end, not only of a ship or a crew, but of a vision of naval warfare that had defined the first half of the 20th century. When the Yamato went down, an era went with her.